Welcome to Elmhurst Time Travelers. I'm Ken Bartels from the Community Bank of Elmhurst, your host, and we're here this time in the Wilder Mansion, right in the middle of Wilder Park in the heart of town. And we're here to talk about the history of Wilder Park and a little bit about the mansion as well. And to do that, I have two wonderful guests. I have the Executive Director of the Elmhurst Park District, Jim Rogers, and the Director of Marketing and Communications, Ginger Wade. Jim, Ginger, welcome to Elmhurst Time Travelers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So we're here in the Seth Wadham's room, and Seth Wadham's was the builder, the founder, the first owner of this structure in whatever form it was back in that time, which is my first question. When did that all start?
Well, Ken, it really it dates back quite a long way, and as you said, there were a number of owners of the facility before the Wilder family. Goes back to, as you said, to Seth Wadham's early in the 1800s. His family settled in Connecticut from England, and then he eventually made his way out to the Midwest. And kind of an interesting story or background on Seth was that he was one of the founders of the Knickerbocker Ice Company and owned warehouses in Chicago where ice was stored and sold and brought by horse-drawn carriage throughout the Chicagoland area, and kind of made his fortune that way, brought it to homes, hotels, saloons, anywhere that ice might be needed. In the late 1800s, about 1868, he came to Elmhurst and bought the land that we're sitting on right now, and which was then, believe it or not, a treeless lot. Not a tree was to be found. And so he built a house here for his family on the property, which was intended to be a summer residence. The idea back then was that when you wanted to go west and get out of the city, you came all the way out to Elmhurst, Illinois. And so the family did that and intended it to be a summer home until the Great Chicago Fire, at which point their permanent home in Chicago was destroyed and they moved out here and made it their residence.
I think it's interesting that at least if you read some of the stories you read about the founding of the community, is that it was largely treeless. Mm-hmm. I mean, so a great deal of effort went into planting trees, a lot of elm trees, right, obviously, but you don't think of it being wide open prairie, which is right, exactly what it was. And you bring up the Great Chicago Fire, which it's going to come up again later when we talk about a few other things going on right here in Wilder Park. But at some point I'm going to have to do a program on the Elmhurst connection to the rebuilding of Chicago, sure, because it's significant, as mm-hmm, you both have found out during your research. So, okay, it's 1868 and a home of some variety is here. There's also a greenhouse. But what were the boundaries, or the approximate boundaries in today's terms, if you can, street boundaries, of the property at that point in time? Sure. Because Elmhurst colleges are already across the street,
right,
or
right,
nearly ready across the street.
Right. Well, it's interesting because even as we talk to folks today, there's people in their mind think, well, this is Wilder Park, and Wilder Park has always been this way, but it's, right, as you're alluding to, it's expanded greatly. At the time, three of the boundaries were similar, which was Church Street on the south, Prospect to the west, Cottage Hill to the east, but then on the north it was Virginia Street. And at the time when the park first became a park, it was only 12 acres, and it's since expanded dramatically to the north, moving up to Margaret Street and then either further north after that. So it's everyone likes to think that this is what it's always been, but actually it's grown dramatically over the years.
Now we're going to get back to Margaret Street and Virginia Street, and they come into play quite a bit later in the history of the mansion. Now, just south of us from where we're sitting, the conservatory, and I know it's new, but there was a greenhouse on that site approximately. But there's an artifact there outside of the conservatory area. It comes from Seth Wadhams going into the city of Chicago, as I understand the story, with a horse and buggy and salvaging things after the fire, including the artifact that just is outside of the conservatory. So I'll let you tell the story.
Sure.
Ginger, you want to tell that story?
Sure. I think it is really interesting because one of the reasons that Seth ended up permanently moving to Elmhurst was that he lost his family home. And during that day, the actual October 7th, which was the day of the fire, he had kind of the foresight, even though, you know, his house is kind of burning and 17,000 properties are destroyed. He sent one of his ice trucks to the courthouse and basically got 2 of those artifacts that were on the wings of the courthouse, and he brought those large urns back to Elmhurst. We do not know where the other one is. I don't think we've ever been able to trace it, but the second one sits today at the, you know, close to the entrance of the conservatory. So it's a great story.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing because the other one probably is in somebody's backyard. It's been there forever. They're the 4th owner of the property over the last, 30 years. They don't know what it is.
Well, and for all we know, the gentleman who drove the wagon downtown picked up
now,
2, dropped one off here, and took one to his home.
They could have taken it too. Okay, I want to refer to my notes because I want to make sure I've got this right. But it's a private home then for the Wadhams, the Henry Kings, the Francis Kings, Henry Selfridges, and then Thomas Wilder in 1905. Is there any significance to any of those folks during that period of time other than succession?
Sure. I think there are a number of things that are interesting that play into that. Again, the first few names that you mentioned, the Wadhams case, the Kings, as you said, it was succession intentionally, and I know we'll come back to the Wilders, but from our understanding, they were the first folks to buy the property that didn't have sort of a connection to the succession.
Yeah, there were some
inheritances and estates and things like that. But one of the things about the Wadhams family that's interesting is they did a lot of the early development, as we're alluding to. They built the first original greenhouse on the property as part of their development. There used to be some folks still remember there was a small gardener's cottage that was in the southwest corner of the park as well. And then particularly interesting, Aurelia Case King took up that tradition and actually hired Frederick Law Olmsted to do some of the design work on the gardens. And as most folks know, he was involved extensively in the development of Central Park in New York City and also the work on the World's Exposition in 1893 in Chicago. And then just the incredible tie-ins to things that are still going on in Elmhurst today. Francis King's wife, Louisa, was one of the founding members of the Garden Club of America. And as everyone knows, who even might be watching this, that the garden clubs are still very, very strong in Elmhurst. And again, to think that there's a connection there that goes back to the 1800s is just remarkable and fascinating.
Well, and we were talking before we went on camera about the Selfridges. And Ginger, I know you knew a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I think it is interesting that it kind of stayed in the family from the beginning. When Seth died, he actually willed the house with a purchase price, okay, not for free, but to Aurelia Case King. And John Case was her dad, and he was a lifelong friend. So he basically gave it to his friend. At that time, his son had passed away, and his daughter was not to be found. There's a great story about that at some other point. So he really didn't have any family to leave it to. And then the Selfridges, really, when Aurelia died, they got it from the trustee of the estate, who obviously was a family friend. So they had it probably the shortest period of time of anyone, because he turned around within a few years, and that's when the Wilders bought it.
And I'm not even sure if we know if the Selfridges
really ever lived here.
Right,
No,
I think it was
I
more of
would
a
doubt
ownership.
it, but just the fact that, it's just kind of an interesting historical footnote, another piece of connection.
Right.
In this case, kind of a worldwide connection. So the Wilders purchased it in 1905, and in 1923, they give it to the Elmhurst Park District. Now, when was the Park District established, and how does it relate to 1923?
Sure, and to even to clarify that a little bit further, Mr. Wilder did not actually give it to the Park District. He gave half of the 12 acres, 6 acres, to the city, and left it with instructions that, with the stipulation that a library be built in the park within 5 years. Well, it turned out over that period of time, the late 1919s into the early 20s, the city was unable to build a library at that time. And at that same time, then in 1920, the Park District was formed. And one of the primary reasons that the Park District was formed was to address the issue of this property in the center of town and how it might be utilized going forward. And so an agreement was reached in 1921 where the Park Board purchased the southern 6 acres from the Wilder estate. And then the city then ceded over the northern 6 acres to the Park District that included the home. And then part of the deal there then was that this mansion would become the library. So it was sort of intended city first, perhaps wasn't going to happen. Park District became involved with the other half of it, and then it all kind of came together to be a park and have the library in it as well.
The land that the Park District ultimately gets via the city and via the Wilders. What was here? I mean, we've got photographs and maps that you provided, lagoons and gardens, and what was here, and I guess the significant things that maybe have gone away over time. Sure. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, sure. But if in fact there was a lagoon here, where was it?
Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
The lagoon is a mystery. It was in the relatively north side of the park, but we really do not have real succinct records on when the lagoon was no longer here. It certainly was here when the Wilders owned the property, right. But by the time the Park District took it over, there's some evidence that perhaps it had already not been there. But I think the more important thing about the property is that all the gardening and planting that had taken place during the ownership is that you mentioned all the birch trees. Well, that was Seth Wadham's family's favorite tree, and he planted a really white birch perimeter around the whole entire property. And then his goal was to find every species of tree that could grow in this climate and put that on his property. So with that, then he added the greenhouse, the gardener's shed. He had cattle here, and he did a rose garden and herb garden. So there was lots of lush vegetation. The kind of interesting thing is a lot of people ask about white birch, and what the city actually put in a sewer system. I think it was I don't have the date here. And when they did that, it required a lot of moisture from the ground, and pretty much all the white birch trees died. So as much as it was lush with that at that time, pretty much over time, those have all disappeared. However, it is interesting that Seth, particularly, was one of the people that was responsible for the planting of elm trees throughout the entire community, and hence the name Elmhurst.
And several decades later, his work was actually also the impetus for the college to try to take on the same mantra of planting anything that would grow in this climate, and right. Then of course they become an arboretum.
Right.
All right, so we're not sure about the lagoon, except that there was one and whatnot. I'm not even going to ask you how one goes about getting rid of a lagoon, or I guess the question would more like be, how do you fill one up if it's easily gotten rid of? How is it that you created it in the first place? We're not even going to do that. But formal gardens were obviously really big in that era. Mm-hmm. So I would imagine around the mansion itself would have been highly formal gardens. Any other locations that we're aware of?
Well, we do understand, as in the present day, where we've got formal gardens both to the west of the mansion and also at the south end of the park. We do understand that at that point the greenhouses that there were some formal garden areas there as well. And again, I just think it speaks to the ownership really from day one. Whoever owned the property decided that with a kind of a majestic central park of its own in Elmhurst, that formal gardens really were sort of what fit the place.
Okay. All right. So the Elmhurst Park District acquires this magnificent acreage in the middle of town for all practical purposes. What happens then? So the Park District's not that old,
No,
and
brand
they
new.
suddenly get an awfully nice thing happen to them very early in their tenure. So what happens then?
Well, what I think is exciting is that I think the Park District at that point really embraces the property and embraces what it means for the community, and embraces that notion of gardening and the gardens. And as its first capital project decides to build a conservatory, and so the Wilder Conservatory is built, which sits just to the west of the greenhouses. Or excuse me, at that time one greenhouse, because what had happened was the first greenhouse was built by the Wadhams in about the late 1800s or 1860s, and then the Park District in about 1921 built the conservatory, and then came back a couple of years later and built the second greenhouse that also served. And what I also think is exciting to recall and recollect, again, up to this day, is that from that point forward, the Elmhurst Park District has propagated or grown its own plants and its own flowers that are throughout this community. And people are, when people come to Wilder Park, I think they're always taken aback and taken with the conservatory and greenhouses. But I think a lot of times folks think of that as a show place, and certainly it is. But they don't, until they become aware, they don't realize that it's a production house.
Yes.
And the way we describe it is that
functionality. It's
exactly.
Yes.
And the way that we describe it is that the conservatory is for show and the greenhouses are for grow.
Sure.
And so we've been growing plants there and utilizing community volunteers even for decades to help us with those efforts.
When does it actually become Wilder Park? When did that become its name?
Our understanding is very early on, probably right in the beginning, kind of in tribute to the family. We didn't happen to see in our records exactly what year, but we believe it was right early on, because even some of the earliest records of the district going back when they refer to the property right away, it's known as Wilder Park.
This draws more on your park knowledge than it does on the actual history of Wilder Park in specific. But in the early 1900s, how did communities, how did citizens use their parks? We can talk about how they're used today, and it's dramatically different, and yet in some ways probably not very different at all. So suddenly there's this park, perhaps on land that many people in the community had never had access to before. Mm-hmm. So how did they utilize it?
Sure.
I'll take that. I think very much the way they do today. This was like a gathering place. It became a gathering place for friends, for families. Let's go to Wilder Park. At that point in time, it wasn't because there was a big playground to climb on, but it was green space, and it was lovely space to sit and enjoy. So there were a lot of, from what we can tell in the photos, a lot of impromptu kind of sporting events. There was no field, nothing like that, but a game of catch would catch on. Ice skating, and what was the ice skating pond was here very early on. And that was obviously a huge activity for the community. Maybe that's what happened to the lagoon. Maybe they decided to trade one for the other. And many of the photos from this time frame show families, walking through the park, picnicking in the park, and really enjoying the gardens, and even walking through the conservatory. So. A peaceful place.
And I think one of the things that's, as Ginger alluded to and when she started her comments, is that we believe that it's used very similarly to this day. And we describe in the parks profession, it's described as a passive park, where, in your mind, when you think of a park, some folks might go to a ball diamond right away or a playground right away, and certainly Wilder Park has a playground now, but it really is more of a passive park where you're engaged in walking and visiting and stopping and admiring the flowers and things like that. It's not so much active as many of our other parks are.
We're going to go to break in just a minute, but one quick question. Because of its location, I mean, parks, I don't want to say that they come and go, but they morph. Some of them become bigger, some of them become smaller, some of them go away, not necessarily in Elmhurst. But do you believe that because of its proximity to some pretty historical places, Elmhurst College to the west, the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church, Hawthorne School, some of the mansions on Cottage Hill, do you think they protected Wilder Park over the years in some ways?
I think they do. I think that again, from decades ago, it really became, I think the park has always been viewed almost on its own as one of the institutions in Elmhurst, sort of not to be diminished,
Sure.
I guess I would say. And when we have visitors come here from other communities, people are always very impressed with the park, but even more so, they are impressed with its location, that in a community that's been built out for decades, that this was preserved all these years and here right literally in the middle of town. So absolutely. And as I said, I think it's sort of an institution in and of itself.
That will cause us to go to break. This is Elmhurst Time Travelers. We're talking about Wilder Park, right in the middle of Elmhurst. We'll be right back.
Visit elmhurst.org to explore the new City of Elmhurst website. Find out the latest Elmhurst news, pay utility bills and parking tickets, report concerns, and much more. Elmhurst.org is an ideal way to discover what Elmhurst offers your business, your family, your life.
Welcome back. This is Elmhurst Time Travelers, and we're talking about Wilder Park with Jim and Ginger from the Elmhurst Park District. And I want to continue. We've sort of talked about the past, and we'll certainly reference that, but I want to continue on into the future. And so it's Wilder Park, and it's here, and people are using it. But you mentioned something just before we ended the first half, Jim, and that was it's a passive park. So there's not a ball diamond, there's not a football field, there's not a soccer field, what have you. Where'd that decision necessarily come from? It was, after all, right in the middle of town.
Well, it's interesting. I can't say that I know for certain, but my take on it, in having some familiarity with the history of the Park District, obviously, is that there wasn't ever a decision not to do something with the park, to not do a ball diamond or to not make it more active. I think, excuse me, that the thought was that it's so beautiful and so well appreciated and adored as is, that's to be retained. So I think it was more of this is what it is and it is to be retained. And even to this day, when we have any discussions about making, I'll say, changes or improvements to the park, the community is very, very passionate about seeing that it retain that passive character. And we've been proud to do that over the years. But people, the community feels very strongly about that. So I think it's more not a conscious decision to not do things as it is a conscious decision to retain the charm that it has.
Well, it always had outdoor ice skating, and that was prevalent until relatively recent times. The tennis courts, of course, come and go. There's horseshoes dotted around, but it is still primarily, as you said, a passive park. When did the mansion actually become the public library?
Sure. Ginger, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Actually, there was a public library that started, I think, in 1916 at the Gloss Mansion. And in 1922, which is after the transition of the land from the city, this part of the park, and including the mansion, was deeded back to the city for them to put a library in. So in 1922, the library came in, and they occupied at that point just the first floor. And then over time grew to obviously 2 additions and, both floors. So, but it's been here, it was here a long time.
So we've got the park, we've got the library. How is it that we got the Lizadro Museum of Lapidary Art?
You want that one?
You bet, you bet. Joseph Lizadro, back in I want to say the 50s and into the 60s, was an avid collector of the lapidary arts. And folks might say, well, what are the lapidary arts? And it's polished and cut gemstones. And started a collection of those. And quite frankly, his collection grew to such an extent that he decided that he wanted to house them in a museum. And so he approached the Park District, again, I believe late 1950s, about the possibility of working together to bring an institution like that to the park. And obviously the park board at that point in time, and continuing to this day, felt that was really a marriage that really fit. And so again, even thinking about that type of a museum, kind of a quiet pastoral setting, natural history-based, so to speak, And so in 1961, the Lozadro Family Foundation and the Park District struck an agreement where the museum was erected, and it's been here ever since.
And really, to the present day, there's conversations about some change in that regard. Much too early to even probably speculate. But over time, the size of Wilder Park has changed. Wilder Park has expanded primarily northward, as you described earlier, and I know it's quite an involved story, but it involves the vacation of city streets. It involves the acquisition and deposition of homes. So can you take me through how Wilder Park goes north?
Sure. I'll kind of jump on that if you'd like. Or,
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead.
There was it's one of those stories, I think, if you looked back on it, you'd say, well, that'll never happen. There were many, many parties involved. The city of Elmhurst was involved. The Elmhurst Park District was involved. The precursor to the now current Elmhurst Art Museum was involved, which was the Elmhurst Fine Arts and Civic Center Foundation. And the notion was to, at some point in time, expand Wilder Park north. At that point, the discussion was primarily to provide for an art museum in Elmhurst, sort of as a companion to the Lozadro Museum. And so each of those institutions over time, as you mentioned, was in the midst of purchasing a number of what were residential properties just north of the park along Virginia and Margaret Streets. And in the late 1980s, I think all of the property had been acquired, and then into the early 1990s, an agreement was reached in which all of those properties were brought together, including the vacation of the streets, as you mentioned, and then the Elmhurst Art Museum was constructed in the northeast corner of the park. Soon thereafter, to be followed by discussions about another expansion, so to speak, of the park and what's in that. And Ginger, maybe you want to pick that up.
You're talking about the library?
Library,
yeah. And that obviously, the talk about the library started, 10 years before it was ever built. But part of the idea of that center was to make it a museum, a library, kind of a focal point for the community. The library was already talking about, they were outgrowing the space here at the mansion and they were ready to move north. So at that point is when the library obviously built their beautiful building, and in exchange for, I think it was about 27,000 square feet. In return, the Park District once again had the mansion and the tennis courts in the surrounding area. So it was, kind of all meant to be.
Right, right.
Well, and I think too, I know there's been talk over the last several decades that if the post office ever decides to vacate its location, the park could even find itself sneaking a little farther north. And that might be kind of a grand entrance all
Sure.
in and of itself. I think so. The park continues to morph and move, but at the same time, it's adding distinction. Lozadro, the public library, the art museum. So, what's in its future, do you think? What kind of plans? We alluded to Lozadro perhaps making some changes in how they present themselves in the park, but what does the Park District think about the future of Wilder Park?
Well, it's interesting you ask, Ken. We're at an interesting point in time here in 2015 in that in the last 10 years, from the Park District's perspective, a tremendous amount of setting the stage for the future has taken place with the restoration of the Wilder Mansion that we're in today, and then also the recent restoration and reconstruction of the conservatory and greenhouses. So it feels to me that from a buildings and a structure perspective, from the Park District perspective, I think we're well set for the future. And we even talked about when the conservatory was restored, our thought was that it's now prepared for the next 90 years. And so from a building perspective, I wouldn't say really that we envision much. Again, respecting those roots and respecting the historical character. As you said, there are discussions that are very preliminary and underway about what the future might be of the Lozadro Museum. But I think if there was one theme to what's the future of Wilder Park, it's to preserve its historical roots.
Rewinding just a bit, the period of time between the vacation of this building and the library moving to its new facility, quite a bit of public discussion about what to do with this building. And I know we're kind of mixing this building and the park, but we're all one big thing here.
That's right.
What was going on right then? What was the public debate? Because I also know, and this is, I don't think directly related, there was a point in time when the new police station was built that there was even some consideration to having the police station be right in the middle of town, not necessarily in the park, but very adjacent to the park. And I know that the public didn't like that. But what specifically was the public discussion as it related to this building?
Sure. I think there was a lot of public discussion, as you indicated, and the overall theme of it was folks concerned that the mansion, in some form or fashion, would not be retained. So that was the concern. And there were a number of years, I want to say there were 4 or 5 years, maybe even a little more than that, where the mansion was not being utilized, when it was still the old library building. And so I think when you have a building like that and it isn't being used for something, every idea under the sun that needs a large space makes sense to be considered to go in there. So I think there was a lot of concern about ideas that were floated out, or someone at a coffee shop said something, and the next you know, well, I heard that they are going to do such and such. But from the Park District's perspective, it was always very important to us that the future, first of all, that the mansion be retained. Again, sort of like retaining the park in its historic grandeur. So I think the notion was that the building needs to be maintained. The question is, what would its use going forward? And there were a number of things talked about. There was talk of perhaps the historical museum being in this facility, and then those talks went. Lots of public input was provided, and then eventually we ended up, the decision was made to end up with the facility that we have today.
Ginger, what kind of activity is the Wilder Mansion experiencing now?
I think tremendous activity. That's probably, if there is a success story to all of that input from the public and the dedication of the Park District to try to retain this. It's how it's turned out. We'll be celebrating our 8th year with a remodeled mansion. We have thousands of visitors in here every year, and more. And what that opportunity is more and more people get to see the beauty of the park and the beauty of the mansion. And I think a lot of the concerns with some of the early discussions is, how can we share this treasure? Because it's so much part of the community. So, I don't know, I think 150 plus weddings, corporate events, nonprofit groups, meetings. It's really a treasure. Open for
television tapings.
Cable television
Those
tapings,
two.
art in the park luncheons. It's just become a real community gathering place, much like the park itself. So we're very proud of it. I think the fact that the community came together, both financially with the amount of money that was donated to the endowment fund and our ability as an agency to provide I think almost $3.8 million to redo this facility and renovate it. I think one of the pictures I have in my head is the day that the 60s addition came down, and what was left was a beautiful mansion, and that during all that time we knew it was there. So I think that's kind of telling about all of that community input has made it the place it is today.
Well, and I think too, the uncovering of the mansion into the space that is here, and the incredibly wonderful restoration that was done. But I'm hard pressed to come up with another park, and I know there are some, but I'm hard pressed to come up with another park that has 2 museums in it, has a library in it, has a restored mansion, restored in the sense of strong functional use, not just repainted the walls and made it look better. A conservatory, formal gardens. The lagoon would be nice to have. No, I'm hard pressed to come up with another one nearby. I mean, we had other wonderful parks in Elmhurst. Don't get me wrong, but this one just got this interesting, and its location.
Right. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that is just because the community for so many decades has taken to this park and now safeguards it, I think, to retain that character and be what is one of the things that makes Elmhurst unique. In that, as you said, there are lots of other parks in Elmhurst, and there are dozens of other parks in this area, but I don't know that you could find one that has all the treasures and is the home to so many fine institutions that this one is.
So both of you have intimate involvements with Wilder Park now and the Wilder Mansion, but I wanted to ask each of you, do you have a favorite moment of time you've spent here, of an event that you've coordinated here, something that each of you has as kind of, one that sort of stays in here?
I'll go first
Please.
on that. It's interesting because I was not raised in Elmhurst, but my mother was, and her family was from here. So from a very young age, I used to come to Elmhurst on summer vacations for 2 weeks to visit. And Wilder Park was where we went. And I remember my mom, 50 years ago, under a willow tree in Wilder. That's the memory I have. And we picnic under this huge weeping willow tree, and I at that point didn't know that was significant. But as I look back at it, I'm like, that's the same park today that I think probably one of my fondest memories of recent years is the holiday tree lighting event and what happens in this place on that evening, because it's all lit up like a Christmas light and there's 1,000 people inside and outside, and I'm like, wow, how did we go from this to that and still have that same set of memories that make it special? So.
My most fond personal memory, I live in town now, didn't grow up here, but live here now with my wife and 2 daughters. And we, for many, many years, attended the Easter egg hunt that's held here every spring. And as we all know, the weather can be a little temperamental sometimes around Easter, but there was one particular time about a decade or so ago where the weather was very temperamental and actually snowed for the Easter egg hunt. And so one of the things that the Partridge Tree staff did...
See, there's a shock.
Yeah, that one of the things that our staff did to kind of take the event to another level was at some point in the event, the Easter Bunny appears and is walking around and shaking hands and patting the heads of children. But on that particular day, with all the snow, Santa Claus appeared as well. And so that was probably the one and only Easter egg event that you could ever say that your children were at, and there was the Easter Bunny, and there were eggs, and there was Santa Claus, and there was snow. And so that's really the one, personally for me, that's always going to stick out.
That's a great story. I don't have necessarily a story like that, but my feeling is that the Wilder Mansion, as both of you were describing earlier, and Wilder Park itself, has been preserved because that's what people want. Mm-hmm. They like the fact that this has been here a long time. They like to stroll through and not necessarily worry about getting hit in the head with a baseball or any combination thereof. But I think the other thing is, during that public debate over what was going to happen to this building, I remember then Mayor Marcucci saying on more than one occasion that if someone suggested taking this building down, that he would chain himself to the pillars on the east side of the building, because the west side of the building pillars weren't there.
Correct.
And that spoke to me about the fact that Wilder Park is just another example, and there are several, in this community of all of the governmental entities coming together when it's the right thing to do.
Sure.
And there are constant examples of that throughout the history of this community.
Well, and Ginger spoke about this a couple of moments ago, but when you think about the notion of that the library was in this building with the expansion that occurred in the 1960s, but had outgrown it, literally had outgrown it, where one of the biggest challenges of continuing to have a library in here was having all those bookshelves in a 100-year-old building and whether the floors could support it. So when the notion then became that the community wants a new library, the notion of, well, how can agencies work together to bring about a new library? Well, instead of just bringing about a new library, you end up with a brand new library and a restored Wilder Mansion. And so if that's not the best example of cooperation, 1 + 1 = 3, I don't know what could be.
Well, I think Seth Wadhams would be pleased with the outcome of his purchase.
Well, we hope so.
Yeah.
We hope so.
Thank you both for joining me here
Thank
on
you.
Elmhurst Time Travelers.
Thank you.
I'm Ken Bartels. This is Elmhurst Time Travelers, and we will see you again.